Good afternoon or evening, depending on what side of the pond you're on, and welcome to a special Team of the Month edition of Across the Pitch. My name is Phil Kennedy, and if you've been listening to our Belarus League specials, then you've already heard Jonny Hibberd on the show. If you haven't been following the Belarus episodes, then this will be your first time hearing Jonny. And he's actually joining us today in the first of what will be a few episodes this month where we talk about his favorite team, our team of the month, the home of the Whopper, Stevenage FC. Welcome to the show, Jonny.
Hi. So I just want to start by kind of painting a picture of what a bizarre season this has been, like even before the coronavirus outbreak.
Now, one thing I did want to establish before you start is that now this season, you came in where last season Stevenage had finished 10th in League Two, which, that's not bad. That's upper part of the table. But this season, it hasn't quite been such the story.
No. Well, let me just give you some statistics. This season, we have managed 3 wins. We've had 4 different managers, so we've had more managers than wins. Okay, in the entire season, we haven't been above 22nd in the table out of 24. We were bottom for 18 weeks of the season, and since the league's been suspended, we've been obviously bottom for a further 10 weeks. And I was wondering actually if 28 weeks at the bottom of the Football League might even be a record. So that's how bad it's been. We've had a squad. Player management is a mess. We've had a squad of over 30 players. And I'll give you some examples. Paul Taylor, ostensibly a striker, 10 games, no goals. Adam El Abd, 2 appearances. Simeon Jackson, who I'm chucking in, actually, he's a former Canadian international. 4 appearances, no goals. We have conceded goals and dropped points in the last 10 minutes of 12 games, and we ended by losing 9 in a row. On top of that, our manager, or now he's not the manager, Mark Sampson, faced an FA racism charge. So the season's really been a total mess.
Well, I mean, the stat that you started off with, which is more managers than wins, I mean, right there, that kind of tells the whole story, and then as you went on, it really doesn't tell the whole story. It sounds like there's been some off the field issues too. I mean, I feel for you having to go through a season like this, because I know what a passionate supporter you are to have to go through a season like this, and then just to kind of have it get suspended, and like you said, now it's just, you're sitting there bottom of the table, and is it Macclesfield has been deducted points, and that wasn't even quite enough to move you up the table.
Yeah, and that's really complicated, because if we're on points per game, I'm not sure how many points they need deducted. They're possibly in line for more points deducted. But as you say, I mean, we finished the previous season quite decently. We had, in fact, a very strong run. We were very much hoping we might sneak into the playoffs. There's a story which I'll probably get onto next week about Elias Chair, who we had on loan last season, who was a revelation. On top of that, we had a new stand going up. It took a while, but that's finally in place, and that gives just the chairman's idea was that it would just look a lot more professional to people driving past than the old kind of non-league terrace that we had. We had a new club crest last summer, which was really, really controversial. English football fans are conservative with a small c, so it's always very, very difficult to make changes. We hosted boxing at our stadium, Broadhall Way. We hosted the WBO World Super Middleweight title. We had Tyson Fury down at Broadhall Way. Now, you mentioned this home of the Whopper jibe, right? And I have to admit to you that even this very day, when I left the house in a Stevenage shirt, a teenager shouted, "Where's my burger?" at me. So fair cop, but I mean, honestly speaking, for a League Two team,
It's not
Burger
a
King
bad sponsor.
absolutely, that looked like a really good deal. And another kind of spin-off thing came out of that. There's a guy on the board, Stuart Dinsey, and he is in the video games business, actually. So is my brother and knows him. And he may have been behind this, but around, I believe it was October, November time, there was a thing called the Stevenage Challenge with a hashtag, okay? And the stated aim of it was that Stevenage, kind of the smallest club you can imagine in professional football, really, could be the biggest club online. Now, that sounded pie in the sky, but as we've seen with Slutsk and Isloch in the Belarus League, you can become quite a big club online very quickly in certain circumstances. And the idea with that was that players would play, I actually don't remember if it was FIFA or one of the other ones, but I'm not really a gamer, but they would play as Stevenage, score a goal as Stevenage, put up the video on Twitter with the hashtag Stevenage Challenge and get free burgers and goodies and stuff. And that seemed to be a big success. So we were shipping Stevenage shirts out to, South America and stuff. And it was quite novel because at that time we weren't scoring any goals. So it was quite novel to follow this Twitter hashtag and watch lots of goals going in for Stevenage.
Yeah, I like that promotion.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool. It's imaginative stuff. I mean, I think a lot of English football fans might feel it's a bit naff, but, I think a small club has to think differently about, how they're going to, make a name for themselves.
I mean, it's not Manchester United. You got to get the word out there some way.
Yeah, absolutely. So also over the summer, we brought in Mark Sampson as a coach. Now, Mark Sampson was the former manager of the England women's team, got them to, I think, World Cup semi-final, and won a lot of plaudits for that. So that seemed, a good person to bring in. We had young players, people like Jamie Fielding and Jason Cowley, who were very promising non-league players. And I know that in Fielding's case, he could have gone to Leicester City and came to us instead. So I think, young players were seeing the facilities that have been invested in over the years, and they felt it was, a good place for them to come. We had a wonderful tour last summer. We went to Jersey, not your Jersey, but our Jersey, the island, to play Jersey Bulls in their inaugural fixture. That was the first time, to my knowledge, that the club's ever toured overseas. So that was really fantastic. And it was all set up. We turned up for the first away game of the season at Salford City in beautiful sunshine, expecting a fantastic season. But it all very quickly went badly wrong.
What did go wrong? I mean, there must be injuries, manager changes, all of the above.
Yeah, I'm going to try and be quite frank. I'm going to talk briefly about the Stevenage chairman, Phil Wallace. And in fact, I'll talk about him mostly in very positive terms. If you go back to, Stevenage as a club started to make their name really in the mid-90s, okay? A lot of us, when we grew up in the area in the 80s, early 90s, to be honest with you, we weren't Stevenage fans. Where we live, a lot of people tend to support Tottenham or Arsenal because their families have usually been families that moved up from London. And so people at school would say, I support Tottenham. I say, why do you support Tottenham? And they would say, well, it's where my dad's from. So I made the stupid mistake of going to my dad and saying, where are you from, Dad? And he said, Portsmouth. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to support Portsmouth. So I did, and I still do. If you ever read Nick Hornby, Fever Pitch, where he's an Arsenal fan, but he also supports Cambridge United, and he describes that, he says it's okay because they inhabit different worlds, and they did for a long time.
I started off as an American. I started off as an Arsenal fan, and It was just because, over here, the Premier League was going to be everything that you would see. And then as I got more into it, I became an Accrington fan. But yeah, in over 100 years of history for both teams, they've never even played. So I know exactly what you mean.
I mean, I would love to say that the same were true in our case, but that all started to go wrong a few years ago. There was a League Cup match between Portsmouth and Stevenage, and I went along and thought, oh, this is a bit of fun, But, as Stevenage have got better and Pompey have got worse, they played each other once too often, and actually Stevenage were quite a bogey team for Portsmouth for a while. So anyway, I'm painting the picture that a lot of people in our area, we didn't grow up thinking of... I mean, I liked the idea of supporting a local team, and I think it crossed my mind as a kid to think, we've got Barnet near us, we've got Cambridge United near us, we've got Luton Town near us. If you ask me about those teams now, I feel I very much dodged a bullet. But yeah, in the mid-90s, suddenly word got around that there was a local team playing some fantastic football. So the manager at that time was Paul Fairclough, and something I'll probably get onto a bit later. In 96, we actually won the conference, what's now the National League, but didn't go up. But the club was going well. It was a growing club. When the stadium only had a 4,500 capacity, it was packed full for big games,
That's awesome.
And yeah, it was. It was an amazing time. And the other thing is, because teams weren't promoted to the Football League for about 3 years in a row, before us it was Macclesfield, and before that it was Kidderminster. And in all three cases, they weren't really good reasons why the teams weren't allowed up. It actually, at that time, the bottom division of the Football League was a pretty desperate league, pretty poor standard of football, very physical. And actually, the top of the conference, teams were playing some really, really good football. And we had at that time players that went on to great things. One of my favourite Stevenage players, Barry Hales, who went on to play for Fulham in the Premier League. Efito Basoji, who went on to play, I believe he's the only former Stevenage player that's ever played at a World Cup. And I remember getting up at 6 a.m. to watch him play for Nigeria. So his, how should we say, career has gone downhill since. That's another story. He's now in prison, I believe. But, these were good times. And in 1998, probably the thing Stevenage was most famous for was the cup run against Newcastle United. So that was Alan Shearer up front for Newcastle. It was a 1-1 draw at home and a 2-1 loss away. There's no shame in that. But here's the thing. The club made a lot of money on paper from the sale of Barry Hales and the cup runs, but somehow or other, under the previous owner, Victor Green, the football club got into a lot of financial trouble. Nobody really knows why, I don't think. So around 1999, I think it would have been, he said that within weeks, the club could go out of business. And local businessman Phil Wallace stepped in. And I think Phil Wallace has been excellent for the club. Excellent for building the club's reputation, building the infrastructure. First of all, they built the Sheppelbury training facility, and then they bought the old sports ground of British Aerospace when that closed at Bradbury End, which is, it's pretty much first-class training facilities, and I think it's definitely helped to attract players and things. So he really built up the infrastructure of the club. But if you ask me, I don't want to say anything bad about him, because with my Pompey hat on, I know what it's like to have bad owners and have your club driven into the ground. So, Stevenage, we've really got an owner that cares for the club, and I've never had any doubts about that. But how can I say this? He's never had the eye for a manager. So some of the managerial appointments over the years have been hit and miss, to put it mildly. So in some ways, in some years, we were quite fortunate. We're going to talk a little bit about Graham Westley. Okay. Have you heard of Graham Westley?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Graham Westley is famous for various tricks, I would say, that have made the club a bit unpopular over the years and made him unpopular with players. When he was Stevenage manager, it's common for a lot of Premier League players to just train in the morning and then to go home in the afternoon or whatever, right? But Graham Wesley's philosophy was that players should work a 9 to 5 like anyone else. So they would come in at 9 a.m., go at 5 p.m. And obviously, imagine that if you're a pampered footballer and you suddenly find that Graham Wesley's been appointed your new coach, you're maybe not going to be that happy. But he came in very controversial circumstances. He was manager of Farnborough Town, and Farnborough Town had just played Arsenal in the FA Cup. And basically, Graham Wesley was enticed to Stevenage and brought about 5 members of the Farnborough team with them. Now, English non-league, I think, is kind of known as being the sort of friendlier side of football, I would say. And I think what maybe slightly irked people about Stevenage was that, in terms of doing business, these kind of sharp practices are fine in normal business, but I'm not sure they made us very popular in non-league. But anyway, Phil Wallace brings in Graham Wesley. There is some measure of success. We get to the playoffs. We didn't win the playoff final against Carlisle, but the club was kind of making progress. And then we parted ways. Some other managers came in.
Didn't he?
Well, that was later because he's actually been in charge of the club 4 times. So I don't blame you. It's really, really hard to keep track of all this. So when he came back in, I don't think Phil Wallace really thought necessarily that he would, get us into the Football League. I think he just probably wanted just a manager who would do well and steer us in the right direction and so on. But it turned out to be a fantastic appointment. So Graham Wesley took us up from the conference, I think in his 2nd season back in charge, and then took us to the League Two playoffs. The semi-final, against Accrington that you mentioned. That was that year.
Don't mention that too much, or we're just going to lose all of our listeners. 20 people just stopped listening. No, I'm just joking.
So, God bless them. I mean, they're in a better place than we are these days. So, following that, we won the League Two playoff final, got into League One, and it was at that point that Wesley was enticed to Preston. And we brought in Gary Smith, who was a former coach in the MLS, actually.
Colorado, right?
Yeah, I believe so. I would say that after Wesley's 2nd spell, things got a lot more shaky. So Gary Smith was in for a while. That didn't particularly work out. Wesley's spell at Preston didn't work out, so he came back in. But of course, by that time, the great team that had gone all the way from the conference to League One had been dismantled. I mean, it's hard to underestimate the achievement of that team, but I suppose an example that people would know that's a bit similar to that was when Bournemouth went from League One to the Premier League, and Bournemouth went from League One to the Premier League with a lot of the same players. Yeah. So players overachieving.
Yeah, I would say that that would be kind of a similar example. Definitely. I mean, any time that you have, I think maybe when Blackpool made it to the Premier League, that might be another kind of example.
Yeah. So, that particular team had, whether or not they were the most talented players, they had amazing self-belief. They played together as a team. The football was not as attractive as it had been in the Fairclough era, but it was very, very effective. It was a very, very good time for the club. While in our first season in League Two, we played Newcastle again, and this time we won 3-1. I was there very, very convincingly. So where I'm getting to with Phil Wallace, right, is that after that, the appointments didn't really seem to work. So Wesley came back, but his team had gone, by then. And I really think if Wesley wanted to, he could have stayed for years and years and really built something. But, he'd been enticed away. And when he came back, I don't think it quite worked. We did get to the League Two playoffs again, but after that, we brought in Teddy Sheringham for a disastrous spell in charge. I mean, Teddy Sheringham was a wonderful player, but not a great manager, sadly. After that, Darren Saul came in. Now, Darren Saul these days is doing really well at Yeovil Town. He is, I think, a really bright young manager. To me anyway, a really, really nice guy. And I think he worked very, very hard for the club. He had one very good season when we just missed out on the playoffs on the final day to Accrington. But I quite liked him. But we were going through a spell where we were throwing away, 2-0 leads. That wasn't working out. So at that point, they turned to Dino Mumria. Okay, now Dino Mumria is a former Stevenage player. He was one of the ones that originally was poached from Farnborough. He had been managing a bit in non-league. I believe he was managing Nuneaton. And the thought was that we just needed, a gutsy coach to come in that could, win a few games, get the fans going, and so on. But I don't really think it was a very thought-through appointment. If you ask me now about Dino Mumria kind of going into this season, and again, to the fans, I think he'd always been a really nice guy. When I was in Jersey in my Stevenage shirt, he spotted me from the hotel and called me over and stuff, and we had photos, and it was all great. I don't know if he was as kind with the players, from what I've heard, but what started to emerge this year was that it didn't feel like Mumria really had a coherent idea of what kind of football he wanted us to play, what kind of player he should be bringing in. So, the non-league starlets that I was talking about, I mean, they were not ready for the step up at that point. Suddenly, as the window started to close, some panic buys came in. Some of those players I mentioned at the beginning who haven't played very much. And you just started to get a feeling that the team was a bit rudderless and a bit directionless. But I mentioned that Mark Sampson had been brought in. I think there was sort of always a plan to move Mark Sampson into the first team coach role. And others have since said that was probably true, and that this was almost a sort of sword of Damocles hanging over Mumria from the start of the season. So after we failed to win in the first 7 games, he was sacked. I must admit that felt like the right thing to do. Now, from where I live in Nottingham, I don't get to go to every Stevenage game, so I tend to kind of pick out certain ones to go for. And I wouldn't have originally been at that game, but because Britain is small, I had been at the Wales-Azerbaijan Euro qualifier the day before down in Cardiff, and Cheltenham happens to be about halfway between Cardiff and Nottingham. So on the way home, I sneaked in another football match and went to see Stevenage at Cheltenham. But we were absolutely terrible that day, lost 4-2. And for the first time, we realised that this was looking like a season of struggle. So Mumria was got...
One thing I just wanted to clarify for our American listeners is, so in Nottingham, you're basically about halfway between like Leicester City and Sheffield, and then Stevenage would be north of London, just a little bit east of Luton, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And Stevenage is a place. Stevenage is a so-called new town. So it was built in the 1960s, basically.
What would be your chief derby? Is it Luton or Milton Keynes or Cambridge?
That's a really hard question. Back in the real non-league days, it used to be Hitchin Town, which is just the next town from Stevenage. And Hitchin Town's a really good little club, but Stevenage became a much bigger place, went on to much bigger things. I'm probably going to get onto in future weeks the rivals that we most look forward to playing again. but they're not anywhere geographically near Stevenage. I think Barnet, on paper, should be our natural rivals. I mean, Barnet lost their natural rivals when Enfield FC went bust. So, that's the logical pair up. But do you know what? Barnet fans are just a bit too nice. It doesn't feel enough like a derby against them. You've got to feel a bit more. You've got to get a bit more hatred than that. I think all the other teams. I mean, the
way that Watford's going this season, it might be too long before Barnet and Watford's a derby.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll tell you what, because Luton had their time in purgatory and went all the way down to the conference. And we quite enjoyed being faux rivals against them. But and we had some great wins against Luton Town, but they put that to bed. I think last season when they beat us. I don't remember if it was 8-1 or 8-0, but understandably, I don't really want to remember.
They were a really strong team 2 years ago when they won the league championship for sure.
Exactly. So I think we've struggled to have natural rivals. If you're Cambridge or you're Luton, you tend to look a bit higher. So Cambridge think that their rivals are Peterborough. For Luton, it's Watford all the way. So we don't really have natural rivals, but I'll very happily tell you next week who we hate.
Well, I'll tell you, it's one of those things when you do have a team, like you said, that's come up from non-league recently, that's kind of one of the things that we struggle with Accrington is, I guess everybody will kind of say Morecambe is the biggest rival, but I mean, going back in the non-league days, there were some other teams that you just kind of move away from, like you said, that you make a whole new set of rivals, and of course, like you've already touched on, Accrington and Stevenage have locked horns a couple of times already.
Yeah, I think Accrington. I mean, if you talk to other Accrington fans, they probably say similar thing to ourselves, that they are in the shadow of some really, really big clubs. I mean, particularly Burnley and Blackburn, who won the Premier League in the 90s and so on. A good friend of mine is from Accrington, but as a kid, similar thing to myself, he didn't really think to support Accrington in non-league, and he's a Blackburn fan. So Accrington's his second team. I'm sure clubs like Burton Albion, have had the same issue.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, the first thing you'll hear from anyone in Accrington is exactly what you said. I mean, they're in the shadow of Blackburn and Burnley. I mean, I think it's 4 miles to the west is Blackburn and 6 miles to the east is Burnley. So,
as close as that. And I would say it's similar for us, because although the miles are a bit further, the sheer size of as clubs of Tottenham and Arsenal speaks for itself. As an example, Tottenham Hotspur,
Watford and Luton are fairly large clubs that are even closer to you.
Yeah, there's a funny thing though, because of the transport links. Transport links are all north-south, so it's much, much quicker to go down to London than to go east-west to one of those places. Why would you bother? But so that's how it works for us. But as an example of what I was saying, Tottenham Hotspur have got a merchandise store in central Stevenage. Yeah. So actually, last year when Tottenham opened its new ground and they said, Spurs are home, and I posted a little helpful map on Twitter referring to this merchandise store, and I said, well, pointing to Stevenage saying not home, pointing to White Hart Lane and saying home. It's one of these things, we're just in the shadow of those clubs, and that's just how it is. And that just tends to mean you've got to find a different niche in the market, as a kind of local club.
But I mean, just because everything is so close together there. Let me ask you this: how far is it from you to the Arsenal or Tottenham Stadium? or from Stevenage, I should say.
Well, honestly speaking, you can go down to Stevenage Station and get off at Finsbury Park, which is one stop before the end. You can be at Finsbury Park in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And then you've got a short walk to the Arsenal Stadium. So that's how close it is.
Yeah, because so like by U.S. standards, I live in the center of town in Phoenix, and the Phoenix Rising Stadium is kind of at the southeastern edge of town, and it's roughly 25 miles from my house to the stadium, and that's just for Phoenix Rising. And then the next closest team would be Tucson, which is about 120 miles from me. So
Yeah.
I mean, you probably, if you're in Stevenage, you probably, I'm just kind of looking at my map here, you probably have, 7-8 teams within that same 25 miles it takes me to get to Phoenix Rising.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, it's the easiest thing in the world to head down to North London. It's not the cheapest thing in the world. That might be a factor for some people, but it's we've always been in the shadow of those kind of bigger clubs. Spurs reserves play at our stadium, and that's just the reality of how it is, really.
Yeah, well, let's kind of steer. I know we steered off of what you were on right now, where you were kind of building up to what had happened this season and where things went wrong, and we kind of digressed right when you were getting to the climax. So let's go back and finish up that story. And now, one thing I had came across, and let me throw this in before you jump in, because I know you're getting right to this year. Is I saw that there was something where Phil Wallace had sold off, I guess, some stock, and it was trying to raise like 1.2 million pounds and only managed to get 300,000. And did that have anything to do with the problems this year?
I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, it's a very sensitive subject, and I've never really heard any satisfactory answers on it. I mean, because they had a fan investment thing for the new stand, and that fan investment thing was done by a company that is run by, of all people, Gianluca Vialli, the former Juventus and Chelsea player, and he'd set up this way to kind of fan fund these things. So he funded the new stand that way, and then I think maybe the process went that if we could just enlarge our playing budget a little bit, then that might give us the edge. And so money was raised, and I think that's probably, and with the period football's about to go into, that's a really, really tough situation, and I'm not quite sure how that ended. Yeah, I mean, I can't blame the chairman for wanting to bring innovative ideas to running the football club, but at the same time, football is a kind of, how would you say, it's a kind of chaos theory business, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, okay, so here's what kind of struck to me, and here's what was kind of a red flag to me, is when I was reading this, it seemed to be that raising money for players' salaries. And so Andy Holt, who of course is the chairman of Accrington Stanley, he's always basically saying, look, if I'm going to borrow money, it's going to be to invest in something physical, like infrastructure, or like you said, with a new stand or something where he knows that if he spends some money, it's increasing the physical net worth of the stadium, and the team isn't throwing that money away. When you start borrowing,
can stop you there.
Okay.
I mean, substantially, I don't think what we've been doing, I don't think the philosophy of what we've been doing up until now has really been very different from that. I think that's, exactly what we've been doing. So improving the stadium, improving the facilities that can be used on non-match days for other things, bringing in, Sheppelbury has been a great thing for, corporate five-a-side teams, things like that. So absolutely we've been doing that. And and this fan investment thing, it seems to be the exception to that, really.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was getting at. It is that up until that point, it seemed like you guys have been doing everything the right way, and then it seems with this latest plan, you're kind of dabbling in that dangerous minefield of borrowing money for player salary. Because I mean, then you're going into okay, if this guy gets injured or just doesn't play as well, then that's not a sellable asset anymore. Where if you add 1,500 seats to the stadium, that means the stadium's worth an extra couple £100,000 when you sell it off, kind of thing.
Sure, sure. I mean, I think, to be quite frank, if we'd had the right coach in charge this season, then I don't think there would have been any major problems with it. But it became a kind of perfect storm, really, of erratic decisions on player recruitment from the management team against that background of fan investment and things. And I just think it never really came together as a coherent thing. So I think that's. But I would say,
I found a quote here from your chairman here. The question that was presented to him back when this plan launched back in May of 2019 was, why should someone think about investing in the club? The answer he gave was 2 paragraphs, and he said, I think there are 2 sides to it. Number one is we're a club on the up. A new 1,500-seater stand is currently under construction, automated turnstiles, new shirt sponsor, a CEO driving us forward, an academy producing fantastic players. It is all going in the right direction. We have also made a record profit on player trading. We have control of our finances, and we have a stable board making the right decisions. And then it's when he goes into the second part of the answer where he says, the second part is what we're going to do with the money that people invest. We missed the playoffs this year by just 1 point, so we are not far off, but we want to start competing more seriously for promotion, and we need to invest to do that. So money we get with the new investment will go into the playing budget and help us achieve our targets on the pitch. So, I mean, it seems to me like what happened is they were building everything the right way, building slowly, missed the playoffs by 1 point, and then they decided to make a gamble, and now here's where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't really know how that's going to be settled. I think if we weren't into this kind of coronavirus situation, I think we would have found a way out of it without too much trouble. Now I think it's fraught with difficulty. And most people who were supposed to get payouts on the newsstand have given up their payments for this autumn in kind of solidarity with the club. So that's the kind of era we're moving into. All of those extra facilities that were great on non-match days, none of those can make any money at the moment. So I think if that hadn't happened, then we it's not a great situation, but I think we would probably have got away with it. But I think it shows, again, taking an idea of, invest some money and you'll do a bit better. That works perfectly well in the kind of normal business world. But the football world is chaotic. There are too many variables, right? And it's absolutely true about the kind of bringing through young players. The big success story there is Ben Wilmot, who is a Watford player now. He played about 10 games for Stevenage, transferred to Watford. You might know that Watford have got the same owner as Udinese. So he was farmed out to Udinese, and in the space of a year played away at Chesterfield, which is near Nottingham. So I saw him play there. And also played away at Juventus. So, and that, a transfer like that brings in, 7-figure sums for the club. So, he's right in saying that. But yeah, maybe it was a gamble too far. I do feel that this season has sort of challenged my faith in the way football clubs should be run, because I've tended to think that if a club is well run, and let's take other examples like this, not Accrington, but take Burton Albion, for instance. Yeah. Burton Albion were, they were a well-run club, a well-run outfit. The stadium's very nice and so on. And after a while, it almost becomes an inevitability that a club like that is going to progress on the pitch because they've got the infrastructure off the pitch.
Right.
And I felt pretty complacent. I was thinking, there's plenty of clubs that are terribly run. I mean, you look at the mess that Macclesfield are at the moment. I think they haven't paid their players on 4 occasions this year. All of these clubs, your Rochdales and your Oldhams, and, we had Bury FC go bust. It's important to mention Bury because the demise of Bury meant that only one team goes down from League Two this season, which is a big difference to what it would have been. But you tended to think if you're a well-run club, you're going to be fine. And what's happened this season has really kind of shaken my faith in. And I would still very much say, as I say, if you're a Portsmouth fan and you've seen your club be asset stripped twice over, then, I can't really say that Wallace has been bad for the club. He's been very, very good for the club. But, things don't always work out. So
was there an on the field, did it just never come together, or, what happened on the field, do you think?
What happened on the field?
It seems like there's more talent there than 3 wins, I would think.
Yeah, I think most of us would agree with that. And we had some pretty good performances. I went to sort of northern away games, away at sort of Port Vale, Scunthorpe. We didn't win those games, but, gave quite capable sides a lot of trouble. But it never just seemed to quite go into the next gear. So Mark Sampson finally comes in, the much-touted, former England women manager. What can I say about Sampson? I mean, he always seems like a nice guy. He's got, an interesting footballing philosophy. I think he very much wants his team to play football. But if I had a criticism this season, his approach is very touchy-feely. I mean, he's very focused on taking care of the players, taking care of the mental health of the players. I mean, and all of that is excellent. But at the same time, to give you an example, I was at a home game, travelled all the way down, walked to the railway station after we'd lost, and there were Stevenage players already at the railway station going home before I had even got there as a fan. And I was thinking, they must have got out of that dressing room like a shot, So I felt, anecdotally, I felt that he wasn't really fostering a winning mentality in the way that we needed. So Graham Wesley was brought back for the 4th time in December. And I wasn't happy about it, but I thought, well, we all thought, if he can get them winning, then, that's, whatever other baggage comes with him. But, when you have a kind of successful manager at a club, and then you try to revisit that 5 years later, 10 years later. There were a lot of fans who were calling for him to come back.
It's one of those things where I think sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. For example, here in Phoenix, the NBA basketball team, there was a guy named Cotton Fitzsimmons. His real name was Lowell, but everybody called him Cotton. So Cotton Fitzsimmons was this guy's name. And I would say between the early 1970s and the late 1990s, I think he coached the team maybe 5 different occasions. And it was like every time that things would be going bad, they would bring him in for a season or 2. He would get things turned around and then hand it off to another coach. It was, you look it up. Cotton Fitzsimmons and the Phoenix Suns. It's an interesting story for you to read if you're bored one day.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds very much the same. So I think that whilst I wasn't expecting anything brilliant, you thought, he's going to kind of instill his kind of mentality and get some wins out of these guys. But apart from one kind of aberration, which was winning 4-0 at Cambridge, which I'm pleased about because my wife decided a few years ago to become a Cambridge fan just to annoy me. So we beat them 4-0. But that turned out to be pretty much the highlight of the season. A complete false dawn. We lost every game after that. So then finally, I think before we get to the end, because we brought in a former player and a coach, Alex Ravel, and he was going to be the last throw of the dice. In the end, he had only one game, which turned out to be the last game of the season away to Crewe. But I just want to mention something that was really, really important this season, and in a really, really hard season, it was something really, really incredibly heartening. Okay, which is basically back in February. If you really want to know a lot about the club, there are, of course, fan podcasts. So one I often listen to is the Stevenage FC podcast. Okay, and basically there's two guys on there, Matt and Reese. Okay, and Matt, I think he's misquoted, to be honest. I think he's misquoted, but he kind of was quoted as saying, well, we were getting so desperate at that time. We were getting so depressed that we were thinking, maybe it's good if the club goes down. Sometimes a club gets relegated, they regroup, and they bounce back. It's a big gamble. But so that was a fair point to make, but it was picked up by a guy called Steve Watkins, who's a long-term kind of fan and commentator on the club, and he was absolutely livid at this suggestion. So he told a really kind of fantastic story that I had never heard before, about a guy called Jim Briscoe. So I'll explain. The hashtag that we had in February was Stevenage for League Football, which got trending on Twitter nationally. And it was a kind of coming together of supporters that we really needed, because I think our support can get quite fractious at times. As a set of fans, we're not always that nice to each other. This is the thing that really brought the club together. And what I would say, I think everybody learned something from it. Okay. And what I learned was that, we tend to think of our club as a young club. Okay. We tend to think of, Stevenage, which became Stevenage Borough, which, by the way, it should still be called. There is a certain poetry to names like Crewe Alexandra and Accrington Stanley. And I think Stevenage Borough should definitely have taken its rightful place as a name in the Football League. But Wallace didn't like the borough suffix. He thought it was a bit parochial. I got rid of it in 2010. And I actually boycotted buying club merchandise for several years after that. But I've kind of got over it now.
I'm on your side with that one. I think that Stevenage Borough sounds more like a football club, where Stevenage just kind of sounds like a law firm.
Yeah, if I ever won the lottery and got a seat on the board, and that'd be my one condition to invest in.
One thing I did want to ask you about is, and this is something I gave you a hard time about, is the resemblance between the new logo and a logo from another club.
Are you talking about Brentford?
Yes.
Well, basically what they did was they, I think they looked at what the latest design trends, and it's true that because like Facebook has got a round profile picture, and so's Twitter now, and it all kind of went round. I know Portsmouth did a version of their club crest that's also round, so I think it was just a fashion thing. Anyway, I'm going to insist that we go back to the story.
Okay,
so
sorry about that.
As I said, everybody learned something about the club through this. And the thing that I learned was that actually there were previous incarnations of the club. So Stevenage Town from the early days in the 1960s. Good piece of trivia for you. Broadhall Way is one of only two Football League grounds that date from the 1960s. Do you know what the other one is? The ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've kind of spoiled that one. Yeah. So there was a team, as I said, it was a new town in the 60s. So, of course, new town with all the facilities it should have, it had a football ground. And there was a football club, Stevenage Town, which went bankrupt. Then we got another club, Stevenage Athletic. And there's an interesting story of what happened when Stevenage Athletic went bankrupt. There was a bit of a row with the local council and stuff, and the local council dug up the pitch on Broadhall Way and vowed that football would never be played there again. But eventually, Stevenage Borough got the pitch back and obviously sorted it out so it was playable and so on. And I don't think I appreciated what those forerunner clubs really meant to like some of our older supporters. So to them, Stevenage FC, Stevenage Borough, was a continuation of those previous clubs. And one of the managers, the manager of Stevenage Athletic, was a guy called Jim Briscoe. Now, he's got a really, the late Jim Briscoe, he had a really interesting backstory. He was a footballer. Kind of his formative football years were actually during the Second World War. So he was playing in the wartime leagues. And then once the war was over, he was a Yorkshireman. He signed for Sheffield Wednesday and was quite successful there. And obviously later in his life, moved down to Stevenage. And Jim Briscoe had a thought. He looked at, places like Burnley and Middlesbrough and so on, not massive places. And he said, well, these kinds of towns are supporting league football. And Stevenage was a growing town. So they were talking about Stevenage growing to 200,000 people. That never quite happened. But his vision, if you like, was that there was no reason why Stevenage couldn't do the same, to the point that he was famous for answering the telephone with the words, Stevenage for league football. When we finally did secure league football in 2010, he was still with us at that time and obviously extremely pleased. So we had a hashtag. That hashtag went viral, and we had T-shirts printed, and a new philosophy came in of, we've got one shot at this now. Let's just be positive. Former player Neil Treble, who I'm good with as long as we're not talking about politics, kind of said, players don't respond to a climate of negativity. So we had a home game against Salford City where, a big crowd turned up. There were a lot of songs. There was a really, really good atmosphere. But again, the team couldn't quite match the expectations, and we lost 1-0. But the fans were still there. The fans were singing for so long after the game that eventually they had to be politely asked to leave by the stewards. And that really turned out to be the highlight of the season, because I can tell you that by the time we were at Crewe away, when the final whistle came in that game, some of us who had bought into this idea, we wanted to be positive for the club. We went down to applaud the team, even though we'd lost. But, there was a row breaking out because people said, why are you, applauding this team? And so, from being a really nice kind of positive vibe, it pretty, quickly descended again. So, as I say, there are other podcasts, the Stevenage FC podcast, if you want to see how deep the rabbit hole goes this season. But I want to talk about where we are now, which is that amazingly this week, we might survive. This week is going to be D-Day. League Two have made a provisional decision. They voted 20-4 in favour of keeping Stevenage in the Football League, even though we're bottom of the league. We absolutely don't deserve it on footballing terms. I think there's no argument there that if we were relegated to the conference, we could have no arguments, really. But if we were kept up, weirdly, that would right a historic wrong, because, of course, in 1996, we won the conference, and the team that were bottom of the Football League that year were Torquay United. And every time the Stevenage score was read out at Torquay United at the end of a game that they'd lost, their fans would cheer because we were basically keeping them in the Football League. And it was a travesty. I mean, if you ask like a Hungarian about the Treaty of Trianon and how angry they are, 100 years later about that, that's pretty much how I felt about Stevenage being denied their place in the Football League. So it would be an odd turn of events if this season, even though we were bottom, we were somehow saved. And it would be an odd turn of events as well if Barrow are elected to the league, having been de-elected from the league in the 1970s in, in the time when these decisions were made in smoke-filled rooms at the Football League headquarters in Lytham St Anne's. So, that idea of electing a team and keeping them in the league is quite, it's quite against the grain. It's not something I'm proud of, but if by some quirk that keeps us up this season, and I would bring Barrow up as well because we need 72 teams to make a football league.
For what
that
you're
would
saying,
be an amazing story.
What you're saying is it's not what you drew up at the beginning of the season, but at this point you take it.
Absolutely. Love to fight another day.
Well, Jonathan, I want to tell you, I've really enjoyed the Belarus episodes that we've done together, but this has been even better. Just hearing all of your stories and knowledge about Stevenage, and I look forward to doing a few more of these here with you as we continue to cover Stevenage for the Team of the Month. And I really appreciate the time today, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
That's great. So next up will be Classic Games. I
look forward to it, and hopefully there's one from 2011 that you can just leave off.
Yeah, that's goes without saying.
No, that's all right.
All right.
You can feel free to talk about it. It's probably something that would be of interest to our listeners to kind of hear the view from the other side.
All right, then. Cheers. See you soon.
Cheers, Jonathan, and thanks again.